What's up guys, and in today's video I'm going to be going through messaging over mechanics, how this recent lesson of me communicating the vision of Killer Chaos OS didn't go as planned, and how I plan on using this as fuel and leverage into the future to better communicate the vision of Killer Chaos OS, and also just ultimately build the next generation of backend infrastructure. So like always, the main mission of these videos is to build the Thinking OS, our own internal operating system that allows us to build the backend infrastructure that we're actively building for our client base, and use these lessons or these videos as lessons in order to power how we're able to log our decisions and also think into the future using mental models and frameworks. So one of the core lessons that I learned from this specific instance, and I think this is just something important that I didn't think about on an active day to day, which is the core lesson of this is it's not about what you build, it's how you frame it to others to see the leverage that you see. So ultimately, one of the things that happened, specifically in this instance, was that I walked into a room and we were communicating, or we were presenting what the vision of Killer Chaos OS, how we were actively going to inject this inside a new build that we were actively doing. And one of the questions that popped up were so many questions, but I could tell that one of the most things that was happening was a confusing feeling, saying, hey, what are you actively building? What is it that you are actively building in terms of the value that you're bringing into the business for our clients? And I think one of the most important things, I think with this new generation of the internet, I think a lot of new things are going to be built and they're not easily going to be understandable, which for me it makes perfect sense. And I realize that one of the most important things that ultimately matters is ultimately being able to communicate what the actual value and what actually is Killer Chaos OS. And that is something that I thought about, but I didn't understand the level of impact that it actively does. And now this is something that I am gonna have to go super deep in, just making sure that, hey, each and every single day I'm actively understanding how I can better communicate what the vision of Killer Chaos OS actively is, and also use this in as a learning tool, because I think for me one of the most important things that I walked away with that specific instance was that, hey, I'm learning and that is okay. Not everyone's gonna actively understand what the vision of Killer Chaos OS is. How can I now just flip the script and actively just show what it is that we're actively doing? Because I think we're still early, to be honest with you, with building the next generation of backend infrastructure. And I think one of the most important things is ultimately being able to communicate that value. So what actually happened in this instance was that I presented my system to the lecturers, and then they came back fast and saying, operating system, what is OS, what is this Thinking OS, or what is this talent operating system that we're actively running, and why wouldn't clients in the US just bypass you, and where's the interaction? And from these three questions, one of the main key things was ultimately why wouldn't US partners just ultimately bypass you and go straight to the person that they're actively working for? And I think this is super easy to think about it in the context of the real world. Like, why wouldn't someone else just come to me and then I can refer them to that? But ultimately in the online space, that is ultimately not the most efficient route to do, and it's a lot of trust based. And I think just being in the space for this long that I have been, I realized that one of the most crucial aspects is that trust based, that ultimately you need to be able to trust and vet whoever is coming into your platform and the people that you're actively connecting with, because I think there may be lots of opportunities, and if these opportunities were easily aware, or there was this high level of awareness specifically to these opportunities, everyone would be everyone would be doing pretty well. But because there's this massive problem that we're actively trying to solve, that clearly shows that there's something there. And I think one of the most important things as well is like framing in terms of OS, and having this operating system that ultimately governs how we're able to make decisions and also build mental models. So the way I like to think about it from a OS operating system standpoint is basically how we're able to make decisions, how we're able to, fully understand what it is that we're actively building, not just, brute forcing it to say, hey, like we're just going to build XYZ, but we're not going to build this internal compass that ultimately dictates how we actively thinking and also making decisions, basically our source of truth. And I think from this, source of truth, this abstract, if you will, thinking OS that ultimately governs how you as a person are able to think. Because I know there are so many things, like you have your Mac OS, Linux, and all these different things, but if you take it more to an abstract sense, what actually governs who you are as a person, I think, the OS standpoint ultimately means a lot more than just, in that specific realm. But ultimately, I understood that one of the key things that probably, was confusing is the terminology. And I think one of the most important things that we're actively going to have to be utilizing into the future is being able to communicate Killer Chaos OS in very, very simple terms to people that also just want to partner up with us, and also just making sure that the messaging is super dialed. Because I think one of the most important things that, I'm starting to realize as we go along with this journey is ultimately being able to say, hey, we can explain this in 90 seconds or less, and if you get it, you ultimately do understand what it is that we're actively getting and solving for. And through this, you ultimately are able to build the solution. But I think, one of the main things as well in terms of what is the interaction levels that we had in terms of the questioning was ultimately how do the key actors and, people that are on this platform interact with each other. And I think this is one of the most important, aspects of it, because there's so many hidden layers that are ultimately at play with this. Because the vision of Killer Chaos OS isn't just saying, hey, like we build XYZ and it's minimal input from that. It is a operating system in the sense of how it is able to think and act as a second ops brain specifically for our clients. And that through, I realize is probably not the best way to frame it. So now it's just becoming, how can I actively reframe and basically break every single thing down in terms of our messaging, because I think our messaging is probably not catered at this present moment in time, and just ultimately just be able to sort of dumb it down and basically use this messaging that we're using to ultimately be able to communicate the vision of Killer Chaos OS into the future, and reframe from specific jargon that ultimately confuses people. Because I think one of the most places that we've probably been lacking is being able to communicate what actively Killer Chaos OS does. And I think it's super simple to think about it, like from my perspective, that I ultimately understand what Killer Chaos OS does because I am the person building it, and from me, my standpoint, it just clicks. But I need to also just realize that, hey, what we're actively building, we know that not every single person is going to get it. So how can we build these mental models and frameworks in terms of how we're able to communicate what Killer Chaos OS does, so that we can ultimately plug in all the holes where there are leaks to make sure that, hey, we are actively communicating what Killer Chaos OS actively does. And that's why in this example I stood my ground, because I knew where the real pain point was, because I knew that the real pain point wasn't in tech, it was in the system thinking behind it. It was the system thinking behind it, which ultimately means this system that we're actively building, I saw the problem, and I know that there's a lot of things to solve, and the problems that people may think or are not as cool or aren't flashy are ultimately the things that ultimately create a lot of value into the future. And this is my own personal take. I think a lot of things that seem flashy and do all XYZ things, I think they're cool in the sense, but do they actively create value for our clients? I think that is a question that we ultimately need to ask. I think where the leverage is as well, and something that I've been thinking about, is that building systems is ultimately so uncool, quote unquote, but I think that is where the leverage lies. If we get to build the hidden, or basically the infrastructure layer that powers the next generation of backend infrastructure in terms of systems, I think that would be a super cool future for me. It may be boring to like 90% of the population, but I think one of the most important things to me especially is ultimately creating value and creating leverage for our clients. And through this, what I've actively been able to learn through this is that language is leverage. If they don't get the words, they'll never see the vision. Ultimately, how can we actively restructure the words and the language that we're actively using to make sure that, hey, our clients or the people that we're actively working with into the future basically understand how we're basically building Killer Chaos OS in a manner that, we're able to not just use jargon and confuse them, but ultimately say, hey, also, we need to make sure and realize that, hey, not everyone will see the architecture, which is basically the infrastructure layer, and how valuable it is, because most focus on the surface level mechanics, not the underlying design. Basically saying, hey, it's okay to just, build XYZ platform and just make sure that it runs and all that things. But what is the, mental models and frameworks, your thinking operating system, as a group, as a collective as well, that ultimately governs how this is actively built. And I think this is one of the things that aren't super glamorous or flashy to talk about, but I think that also is where the compounding leverage lies. And through that, that is where the clarity compounds, which is the third lesson that I've learned, which is the sharper that I get at simplifying the message, the more unstoppable the model becomes. I think, in as much as we're still kind of in the early phase, I think this is a good springboard to ultimately refine how we're actively able to communicate the vision of Killer Chaos OS. Actively not just go super deep into it, because not every single person is ultimately going to understand each and every word that we have to say in terms of Killer Chaos OS. And I think one of the main things is ultimately not stopping, because just because some people don't get it, I think we still have a lot of value that we're going to be able to produce into the future. And through this, we ultimately understand that we might still be very early in what it is that we're actively building for the next generation of backend systems, and that's okay. But how can we actively now just use this as a lesson, as a learning lesson, and actively just build from this and saying, hey, staying true to what matters. I think this is one of the most important things. I think if all these 4 different lessons that I have been able to learn, I think number 4 is one of the key ones, which is, if OS isn't just about software, but it's a mental framework, own that. I think from my personal standpoint, that I will always stand by having a thinking OS, basically your own internal operating system that all actively governs how you think, how you're actively able to do things, and also how you're solving problems. Because without this thinking OS, you're not able to get to the level that ultimately governs how we're able to build these backend infrastructures. Specifically for me, at least I've seen in my instant, that this is one of the modes that leverage actively lies in. And then saying, hey, why this all matters is ultimately down to systems only scale when people buy into the vision. Mechanics come second. So how can we actively focus on the messaging over mechanics? The mechanics we can keep as a separate part if we want to get more deep and technical in it, but how can we actively just make sure that the messaging is correct, in the sense that, hey, we're actively just driving forward and we're able to translate the vision of Killer Chaos OS and make it in a way that is digestible and simple to understand. And if I master the art of translation and making complexity digestible, then I unlock more leverage than any line of code could actively build for me. So basically, the main takeaway from this that I would like to just share and also just learn from is, ultimately messaging is super important in every facet. I think when you're communicating the value, messaging has to be one of the core things that ultimately allows you to then get the deal over and also get the vision across. Because I think in as much as we've been focusing on building, I think one of the most important things is to super dial in the messaging in terms of how we're able to build the vision of Killer Chaos OS. I think if you've watched any of these videos, you'd probably get it, but then ultimately I realized that, hey, not every single person ultimately understands what Chaos Killer OS basically is and how we're actively building for it, and that's okay. The question then becomes, how do we actively change our messaging and refine it in the sense that it's easily digestible and that people actively get the mission that we're actively building for. Because I think one of the most things that we need to fix up, and I need to fix up as well, is ultimately just working a lot deeper in the trenches in terms of the messaging, because when you're so focused on building the product and building the service, you ultimately kind of just needs to bring that back as well, to ultimately make sure that you're building and you're accountable in terms of making sure that the messaging is also correct. Because I think into the future, this is one of the most important lessons that we could possibly learn. Then the question just becomes, how can we actively just use this as a springboard to scale into the future? And I think messaging is one of the most important things that we're going to be using and making sure of into the future. But through that, we're ultimately going to drive towards the main mission, which is ultimately to inspire millions of people, impact, have this huge amount of impact, and also to redefine industries. And through that, I know we're going to fail a lot, like I've always said. And I think through this, this quote unquote failure, which is temporary defeat, in terms of understanding, hey, this is a lesson that we need to learn. It's a data point, and that data point ultimately becomes how we're able to build into the future. And I know, like I always say, we're gonna fail so many times, but we're also gonna keep on moving forward, and we're gonna build anyways. And if you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to connect with me on X, LinkedIn, Instagram, and I will see you guys in the next video.